Hello everybody, and thank you again for joining me for another chapter in our virtual tour of the country. We are exploring Jerusalem, and we've been doing that for the last 2 weeks. And we started chronologically with the city of David. We had a short orientation about how the city looks like geographically as well, which is important when it comes to Jerusalem. And the chapter for today, episode 2, in Jerusalem's excursion that we are taking, will focus on Temple Mount. It will be fair to say that from a certain point in the country's history, people showed interest in Israel not because of the road system, not because of its strategic significance. The main attraction for nations and countries and religions to come to Israel was one location, and that would be the Temple Mount. Until the days of Constantine the Great, Jerusalem was holy just to one people, famous around the world, but only one people considered the place holy, and therefore Jerusalem was a place of no significance on any other level. If it wasn't the religious part of it, nobody cared about the city. But from the days of Constantine, Jerusalem becomes to be the focal point for the Christian existence in the land as well, and later on the Muslims. So when you speak about Israel, you speak about Jerusalem. When you speak about Jerusalem, you speak about one location, and that will be the top of Mount Moriah, Temple Mount, from a certain point in history. So today we're going to speak about Temple Mount. I'm not going to speak a lot about the temple building, just a little bit, but we're going to speak about what happened on top of Temple Mount. And we'll speak about many buildings that stood there from the days of Solomon's temple all the way to the Dome of the Rock, with the Christian occupation under the Crusaders and the Romans that built a temple on top to humiliate the Jewish holy site, etc. That will be the purpose of today's session. And therefore, we are going to focus on the Temple Mount itself and what happened over there. But we'll start before the place can be called Temple Mount, because Temple Mount will be the man-made extension of the natural bedrock of Mount Moriah. So we're going to cover about 3,000 years of the mountain's history. We have to do that very briefly, the time is short, and try to include and fit in as much as we can. I'm going to use the PowerPoint presentation. I'll try to fit in some video segments as well. It all depends on the challenges that the technology is presenting here, and we'll see how it works. Let me bring up the slides and the presentation that you know so well by now, and we'll start with that. So today we're going to speak about Jerusalem. We're going to speak about episode number 2, and we're going to focus on the Temple Mount. We always start with that slide that you see in front of you, because if you came to Jerusalem as a pilgrim, and that would be the main reason for your visit, especially for the Jewish people, and if you came from Galilee, your journey will go along the Jordan Valley, and then you come to Jericho, the big oasis down here, and you're climbing these very mountains, the mountains of Judea, all the way to Jerusalem. As you can tell, even from the picture, that was quite a climb. So everything was about the temple. And when today we see the controversy around the Temple Mount, you have to go back to Zechariah 2. The prophet speaks about Jerusalem being a stumbling stone. It's not Jerusalem as the city. It's one very, I would say, limited location geographically. It's Temple Mount at the top of Mount Moriah. That will be the center of tension and the center of attention as well. So episode number 2 will take us today to Temple Mount, but as I said, you cannot call this area a Temple Mount before a certain time in history. That would be the days of Herod. Jerusalem and Temple Mount, or Mount Moriah, has a more ancient history than the days of Herod. Well, we use different names to describe that mountain geographically. Temple Mount from a certain time, Mount Moriah, which is of course very famous as well. Only in one place in the Bible says that a temple was built on Mount Moriah when Solomon built it. It was called Mount Zion as well. And Josephus Flavius, when he describes the city in his book Jewish Antiquities, he calls it the Eastern Hill. All these 4 names are connected to one hillside, and of course one of the peaks, not the very top. That will be the place that the whole world is looking at as one of the biggest places of controversy. Well, we need to go back to some of the topography just as a reminder. There we are speaking about the valleys around Jerusalem, the Kidron Valley on the eastern side, the Central Valley cutting through town, and there we have the Valley of Gehenna. We have the transversal valley that goes this way, and then we have the Bezeta Valley, but this will be only important later on. The eastern hill is made of the city of David. Keep in mind, all this is Mount Moriah. The eastern hill has the hillside as well. That's where the city of David was built because of the spring. And it also has the rest of Mount Moriah, but all of it geographically is one mountain, a mountain ridge. And then we have the western hill, the lower city, and the upper city. So when you look at the city from the side to understand the different elevations of different parts of town, you'll see in just a minute how it looks like. Zooming in, Mount Moriah, all of this hillside, we are going to focus more today on the Temple Mount area than any other part of the mountain. Look at the city like a little schematic depiction going from east to west. That will be the Hinnom Valley. That will be the upper city. Please notice that the upper city is higher than Mount Moriah, which means you cannot see Mount Moriah coming from this hill. You have to climb that hill to see the mountain down below you. Same thing with the Mount of Olives and the Kidron Valley. So Mount Moriah will be lower than the rest of the city, and Jerusalem itself was always situated on top of two hills, the upper city of the western hill and Mount Moriah or the eastern hill. I hope that that kind of rings a bell, because last time we dedicated enough time to focus on the topography. But once again, when it comes to Jerusalem, those details are very important. The time frame for today, we're going to go almost the whole chart here, because we're going to go from era to era, and we'll start with the very beginning of the story, since when Mount Moriah became to be important. Well, it became to be important with the purchase of the mountain by David. The Bible tells us that David sent Joab, his mighty general, to count the fighting men. We are told later on that he was punished for that. And the angel of the Lord, after destroying much of the country, 70,000 people were killed, is coming to destroy Jerusalem as well. And he is resting on top of Mount Moriah. In fact, the Bible says he was standing in the air between heaven and earth, and David was ordered to come and purchase the property by the prophet Gad. So that was a threshing floor that was owned by Araunah, who was the ruler of Jerusalem in Jebus. I do want just to focus on that for a minute. When you read the account in the last chapter of 2 Samuel, and it comes to verse 23, Your Majesty, Araunah gives all this to the king. When you go to the biblical text in Hebrew, and there's only one biblical text in Hebrew, that's how you should read it. And other things the king offered the king. And the question is, how many kings are present in that encounter? Well, David is one. Who should be the other one? Well, the name Araunah is not a name of an individual. It's a title. Basically, it means the governor. And therefore, Araunah most likely was the king of Jebus, that David spared his life and his people as well, and integrated them into his own society, as long as they were willing to worship the God of Israel as well. So this is a fascinating verse, and if you read it correctly, you come to the conclusion that two kings are negotiating. One is the former one of Jebus, and the other one is King David. So the place was purchased by King David for his son Solomon to build a temple, but that's the location. That's the mountaintop, and it's not the highest geographical location of Mount Moriah. Let's look at the mountain from the side. The Gihon Spring is down here. All this is the city of David. And then you have that depression that will be filled up in Solomon's days. You do have the location of the temple that will be here. But you see, the mountain keeps going higher and higher. The very top of Mount Moriah geographically is where the Garden Tomb is today. Mount Calvary, to so many Christians, the place of the crucifixion of Jesus and the tomb and the resurrection. So this will be the whole full length of Mount Moriah, about a mile to a mile and a half long. And some changes took place here in Solomon's days. When he was building the temple, he filled up to that depression here. And today, the city or the hillside is one continuous hillside. You no longer have to go down to the valley and climb a steeper mountainside. That was done in Solomon's days. The Bible says he employed 150,000 Canaanites in order to carry soil and dirt to fill up the depression. It will be called the Ophel. And then on one of the peaks of Mount Moriah, but not the very geographical top, the temple was built. and on the man-made filling, that's where the palace and the royal quarters were built. So the first time that something is standing on top of Mount Moriah is the altar in David's days, but a structure that will be the temple that Solomon built. We call it in history the first temple. Nobody called it the first temple back then. They did not know about a second temple. It was called Solomon's temple. This temple lasted until 586, when it was conquered, destroyed by the Babylonians. So this will be the hillside. And this is a place that we cannot call yet. We cannot call it Temple Mount. There was no Temple Mount, just a temple building standing on top of Mount Moriah. If you go back to the timetable, we speak about the second temple now that will bring us to the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, that gave a proclamation that the Judeans can return to Jerusalem, not to restore the kingdom as they were hoping, no doubt, because the leaders, Zerubbabel from the house of David, had every reason to believe that he's going to be made king by the Persian authorities. But Cyrus's proclamation was very clear. It wasn't to restore the Jewish kingdom, it was to rebuild the temple. That was Persia's policy vis-a-vis other nations as well. And the Judeans, or the Jews now, were also incorporated into that. So we speak about another temple that will be built. Construction started and lasted about 20 years, and it was dedicated in the days of King Darius, the king of Persia. And that was Zerubbabel behind the project, and Joshua the high priest. They hesitated for a while, but the temple was built. And as we read in the prophets like Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, this was a very small temple, a very disappointing one. And the prophets give us the account that the people that remembered Solomon's glorious temple, they wept bitterly when they saw this one. But again, God promises through his prophets to the nation that the glory of this one will be far beyond the glory of the first one. In this temple, there are a few things that are missing, but it will be the one and only place of worship. Keep in mind, the reason for the punishment for the exile was the Israelites worshiping on multiple places, not just the God of Israel, but foreign gods as well. Well, that lesson was well learned by the people during the exile. We no longer hear about building other high places. It is indeed the temple, the one and only place that the Jews are going to worship on. So the exile was a good time of reflection, at least to educate the people what exactly is that God wants from them, and to focus on the centrality of the temple as the one and only place of worship. Well, there's no commandment in the scriptures to rebuild a temple. By the way, there's no commandment in the Torah to build the first one either. The Torah only speaks about a tabernacle. Keep in mind that the idea behind building a building, that's in the book of Samuel, the book of Kings, but it's not one of the commandments that the Torah mentions about building a place. The Bible does say that God is going to choose a location, that he's going to dwell there, but it doesn't say you will build a building for me. The Torah only commands to build a tabernacle, but there's no clear commandment to rebuild the temple as well. That may be a reason not to practice and not to worship and not to take that temple too seriously. But once the nation is losing its national identity as well, that will be the focal point, not just for religious practice, but also to the national aspirations. Well, since the line of the priesthood was well known, and they kept those records during the Babylonian exile so they can practice in the new temple as well. So things were done by a certain protocol, but few things are missing. Number one, there's no Ark of the Covenant. We are told very clearly that in the days of the second temple, the Holy of Holies was a room with no object inside. It was filled with God's divine presence, the Shekinah glory, but no object. We also are told that the garments of the high priest that normally had 9 pieces are missing the Urim and Tumim. Nobody knows exactly how these used anyhow, but we do know that this was not part of the garments of the high priest in the days of the second temple. It's possible that some of Temple Mount, some of it was fixed by the Hasmoneans before the days of King Herod the Great, but again, we can not yet call it really Temple Mount. So we speak about the first few centuries of the second temple that we do not know much about. We do not have any kind of records from outside sources, very, very few, about that temple. And besides that, not much information is given to us, how it used to look like, what were the practices, but then things, of course, will change. Do we know the location of the temple, which is a major debate? And I hear from a lot of people that what we call Temple Mount cannot be the location of the temple, etc. Well, let me say one thing to that. Tell me your politics and I will tell you your archaeology. People that take a side which is very anti-Jewish vis-a-vis Jerusalem will claim, and they cannot prove it in any way, that the Temple Mount is not the place for the temple. In other words, Jews have no claims for Temple Mount or to East Jerusalem or maybe to Jerusalem at all. But we know better than that. Number one, the location was known from the days of David. So everybody who lived in town and all the pilgrims who came to Jerusalem knew exactly where the temple was standing. And then during the Babylonian exile, not everybody went to exile. Many people stayed behind. The Babylonians even encouraged the locals to get a more autonomous way of life. They did not build a temple, but it was only 50 years. People lived in Jerusalem during that old time. People lived in the area. They knew exactly well where the temple was because the mountain was covered by ruins. And therefore, when Zerubbabel is coming back to rebuild the temple, the location was well known by everybody. And keep in mind, you cannot switch locations at will. There's one place called holy in the Bible, and that's Mount Moriah. And therefore, even to consider to build a temple on a different location, the question should be why? The Persian authorities did not limit Zerubbabel where to build a temple. And obviously, if you're limited to one rock, and the place is known, that's where you are going back. So we do have a continuous records of where was the temple standing from the days of Solomon, all the way down to Herod, etc. There's no reason to question the location of the temple. The question is where on top of Temple Mount, that was a huge man-made complex, the temple was standing. That's where we have some confusion. But there's no confusion about the location of Temple Mount in the temple's area. But once the Temple Mount was built, the question is, and this is the only question, where on top of Temple Mount the temple itself was standing, but there's no question about Temple Mount being indeed Temple Mount. We do have the continuous records, continuous evidences. Everybody knew where Solomon's temple was when Zerubbabel built his, and Herod's building was built right above the one of Zerubbabel. So to ask the question and to make those doubts about Temple Mount cannot be because of the temple, that's not history, it's not religion, it is in most cases politics. Well, let's speak about a source that teaches about Temple Mount from the days of Herod. The Gospels speak about that in the book of Acts as well. We do know from the historian Josephus Flavius a great deal of information about how the temple used to look like. We know from Jewish sources, the Mishnah and the Gemara, about the practices of the temple, about the priesthood, Sanhedrin, everything that had to do with daily practice. It's well recorded. Some of it may be just commentary and not proof and not facts, but all the idea behind the temple, the main idea behind it is well recorded in the Jewish sources. And again, you can ask questions about how is it that you do that and that, but you cannot ask questions about the connection to one location, which is the temple's area. Greek and Roman writers also speak about a temple, and one thing they've noticed that this is a temple that doesn't contain a single statue. And that really puzzled the Greek and the Roman historians. How can that be? And what kind of God the Jews are worshiping that doesn't have any shape and any form? And of course, archaeological excavations. Ever since we excavate around the Temple Mount, not under the Temple Mount, but around the Temple Mount, it gave us a lot of information about how the city used to look like, about how the Temple Mount was built. And this is quite an amazing project that we're going to speak about. Next meeting, we'll speak about the excavations around the Temple Mount, and then we'll go into details to speak about this amazing construction. Well, without going into too many details regarding this one, but we have to say that the temple was indeed the one place of worship for the Jews from the days of the Second Temple. It was indeed the national center as it was a religious one, but not for everybody. I'm sure that all of you remember Jesus and his debates with the money changers and debating the rabbis and the teachers in the temple. He was not the only one. He represented, no doubt, a much broader sentiment vis-a-vis the temple. Many people in the Jewish world did not like to see what happens, all the trade and all the commerce in the Gentiles' court. And many others question how legit will be the priesthood in the days of Jesus, because the priesthood was coming from the Hasmonean dynasties and not the genuine Zadokite priesthood. There was a big issue within Judaism that led to a great split about how legit is the priesthood in the temple. But once again, we may discuss that in another occasion and not right now. Let's carry on and speak about the Temple of Herod. We speak about the days of the Roman Empire. That will be the time in history we can start calling the whole complex Temple Mount. Until then, Mount Moriah was a temple on, but the builder of Temple Mount was Herod the Great. We speak about the man-made extension of the bedrock. I know it's not easy to follow, but hey, you do your best, huh? If this is the bedrock of Mount Moriah, and you want to build a man-made box to enlarge the platform just to accommodate more people, you need to fill up the gap somehow between the platform, the retaining walls, and the bedrock. That would be the famous western wall, the western retaining wall of Temple Mount. That would be the eastern wall. If you remove all of that, as it was until the days of Herod, all you see is the naked bedrock and the temple building standing on top. But if you want to build a platform, which was close to 36 acres inside, the largest man-made platform in the world ever, you have to be very knowledgeable how to do that. You need to have the skills, you need to have the know-how, and the Romans did. And although we speak about the days of King Herod, who was behind the whole project, the knowledge, the information, his engineers were knowledgeable with, they basically got it from the Romans. And therefore, the Roman civilization was shared with everybody who was interested, including Judea. And Herod was always in being more Roman than the Romans. He was more than happy to use the Roman knowledge of construction in order to build that project. So that's how it used to look like. I know it's not easy to see that in a 3D, but that's the best we can do in our limited resources right in front of us. Well, keep in mind that Mount Moriah is not the highest place in town. Well, there was a tradition, but it's not in the scripture, just a tradition, that when people came to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, for example, Josephus Flavius tells us that one Passover, they offered the 250,000 lambs. That's a lamb for a family. We speak about millions. City wasn't large enough to accommodate all of them. And therefore, people had to camp, literally camp on the mountains around Jerusalem. Think about the huge campground. And you can have the Passover meal as long as you saw the temple. You had to have an eye contact with the temple. The problem is that from this hill, if you're coming from west, you cannot see the temple building because the western hill is higher. And for that reason, Herod's building was built 60 feet higher than the biblical requirements for one reason only. The people that are coming from the western side will be able to see the building as well. And by doing that, you are clearing a lot of space to more people to come and celebrate. So the temple was in a certain, on the right location, no doubt, but the dimensions were bigger than it is in the scriptures. It was bigger than Solomon's temple because of that ritual that had been developed only in the days of the Second Temple. We do not know if that practice goes back to the days of Solomon and on. We do know that was the practice in the days of Jesus, for example, and the days of Herod's temple. Well, just zooming in for just a minute, you do see the man-made complex once again. You see the Antonia fortress named after Mark Antony, who was Herod's patron and was built by Herod. This will be also Praetorium. Praetorium is a generic name in Latin, simply means headquarters. So when the Roman governor came to Jerusalem, he had to position himself in the place that he could see what happens on Temple Mount, and that will bring him to the Antonia fortress. If that was the place that the governor chose for his headquarters, it will make it Praetorium. So the trial of Jesus took place in that castle that was overlooking the temple's courtyard from the northern side. The Temple Mount was divided to the Gentiles' court, the big marketplace. Inside the temple section, there was a women's court, and there was a men's court, and the building. The back wall of the building, the back wall of the Holy of Holies, is closer to the western retaining wall of Temple Mount, the famous western wall. And that's the one and only reason why the Jewish people come to the western wall. We want to come as close as we can to the ancient Holy of Holies, and that will bring us to the western wall. So that's how the temple looked like on top of Temple Mount. In fact, when you view today the city from a distance, you can only see Temple Mount that covers quite a big part from Mount Moriah. So part of Mount Moriah today is not even visible. It's simply under the massive Temple Mount that was built in Herod's days. And by the way, there was a line here, a little fence right here that separated the Gentiles court from the limited Jewish area. Some of you may recall that Paul was arrested. They brought accusations against him that he brought a non-Jew into the limited Jewish area. And lo and behold, they found a stone in Jerusalem that reads in 3 languages that from that point on, only Jews are allowed to enter. So this stone was found, and we do know the dimensions, give or take, and that's where this line used to be all around the sacred area, separating the Jewish section from the Gentile school. Well, where was the temple located? Let's try to have at least an idea. And this idea is based on a theory that was brought up for the first time by a professor by the name of Asher Kaufman about 40 years ago. Since we don't know the exact location, because the Bible doesn't tell us, at least we do have some ideas about where the temple was standing. Let me try to share that with you. We do know from some of the books of the commentators that when the high priest assistant was burning the red heifer, the red cow, you go to Numbers 19, the whole story is there. You need to provide ashes of a red heifer for symbolic purification. And that was done on an altar, which is on the slopes of Mount of Olives. Folks, once again, nothing here is biblical. We speak about traditions. But that tradition, which is given to us in the Mishnah, will tell us that when the high priest assistant was burning the red heifer, he could see from the altar through the eastern gate into the temple gates, which means that 1, 2, and 3 should be on the same line. The problem is you need to know 2 spots beyond any doubt to establish a line, and we don't. We only know 1. We know the eastern gate, because the eastern gate of today is standing right above the eastern gate from the days of Herod, the days of Jesus. And therefore, the question is, if indeed the altar was here, and the eastern gate is in the same location, the temple should be someplace around here. It could not be in the area where the Dome of the Rock is standing today. So this will be the Dome of the Rock. Some Jewish sages and some Jewish scholars do believe, in fact most of them, that that will be the location of the temple. At least if you go by the theory that the altar, east gate, and temple should be on the same line, that could not be. You can clearly see it's not on the same line. If you mark a line for the Dome of the Rock, and you go above the eastern gate, it falls on Mount Scopus. So there was another place on top of Temple Mount that the bedrock is not covered by the man-made platform. There should be a reason why it was not covered. And this one is, give or take, the same line with the eastern gate and the Mount of Olives. So maybe the temple was not standing right here. Maybe the temple was standing about 300 feet to the north of it, which is a possibility. In both cases, the upper platform of Temple Mount. So the question is not Temple Mount. The question is not the upper platform. The question is where on the upper platform the temple was standing, and we do have at least 2 theories. So that's just to deal with that issue of where was the location of the temple. After the temple was destroyed by the Romans at AD 70, Temple Mount has a continuous story. You need to understand from the Jewish perspective, not having a building standing, it doesn't mean that the mountain is not holy. And therefore, Temple Mount is still carrying that holiness with it, so to speak, for the Jewish people, with or without a building. So when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, they made it the headquarters for a Roman legion that was now stationed in Jerusalem, the 10th Legion, in the upper cities area. And only 60 years or so later on, Adrian, the Roman emperor, decided that he's going to rebuild Jerusalem, but now as a Roman pagan city. He named it Ilia Capitolina, and the decision was made 132. It will lead to a big rebellion among the Jews called the Bar Kokhba rebellion, but Temple Mount now is housing another building. And that building will be a pagan temple to Jupiter that was built as a symbolic gesture to humiliate the Jewish holy site. That's where the confusion started. Where is the guarantee that the Romans cared about the exact location to build their temple? Most likely they couldn't care less. They built their temple maybe in places that they could clear the old ruins easier. We don't even know how Temple Mount used to look like back then, but we do know there was a temple built on top of Temple Mount, and that's what starts the confusion, where exactly was that temple standing. So now Jerusalem is a Roman city that was built Roman style with all the Roman road systems and the marketplaces and everything that you find in a Roman city, theaters and amphitheaters, etc. But we are focusing on Temple Mount, and that's still, question is still there. Where exactly was the Roman temple built? We do not have a good answer for that. Time goes by, we are making progress now to the days of Constantine and the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine means the Roman Empire under a new religion. When Constantine the Great started his revolution, and historians are marking the beginning of it when a new capital was dedicated, and this was a small fisherman village called Byzantium on the shores of the Black Sea, that Constantine decided to build his new Christian capital on the same location and named it Constantinople. It was dedicated the 11th of May, 330. For historians, that's also marking the beginning of the Byzantine Empire. So Israel, Palestine, was always in the Byzantine Empire's territory. That was the Greek-speaking part of the Christian Roman Empire. So named after a small fisherman village, Byzantium, it named the whole era. Well, that would be an interesting story because now Jerusalem is a Christian town, and you would assume that the Temple Mount will be somehow respected by the Christians. The very opposite happened. Keep in mind that you're teaching the masses about a new religion. We speak about the very first days of the Christian faith, which is shared by pagans basically. And for that reason, Temple Mount was not only in ruins, Temple Mount was the dump of Jerusalem. The idea was, and that was the way to educate the masses, is that Jesus prophesied in Luke 19 the destruction of the temple, and for that reason the temple and Temple Mount should be in ruins. So number one, the pagan temple was torn down as all other pagan temples around the Roman Empire. But in the case of Jerusalem, a church was not built instead. They simply left it neglected, and then people came to throw the rubbish for nearly 300 years. Temple Mount was the dump of Jerusalem, totally ignored by Christian historians sometimes, and it's fascinating to watch that dynamic. Look at this map that you see in front of you. It's called the map of Madaba, found in the town of Madaba in Jordan. It's a mosaic map, about 2.5 million stones, pieces, and it shows holy places to Christianity in the country. It's in a bad condition, but the map of Jerusalem is in a very good condition. The whole church that this was the mosaic of, it was found in 1884 in the town of Madaba in Transjordan. It was found by the local Bedouins and some damage was done. By the time the scholars arrived, it was in a terrible condition, but Jerusalem's map is almost intact and teaches us quite a lot. For example, when you speak about Jerusalem, Temple Mount covers about 15% of the city. Temple Mount covers a large area. It's not even on the map, totally ignored by the people who made that map. By the way, we know even the time frame because this church here was built by Justinian, 543 AD, and this whole church was conquered by the Persians in their invasion 614, and therefore this is the map of Jerusalem for the second half of the 6th century. The Cardo, the main road, still there by the way today, and then we have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That will be the center of the Christian town. On top of that, we have the Golden Gate because it's important, so it's marked on the gate, second coming of Jesus. But it doesn't lead to anything. Eastern Gate leads to Temple Mount. And if the Eastern Gate is so big and out of proportion, Temple Mount should cover a large area. It's not even on this mosaic map. And then you have the Nia Church or the New Church. And again, the question is, where's Temple Mount? Totally ignored. So in the days of the Byzantines, Temple Mount was indeed covered by tons and tons of garbage, and that was the dump of Jerusalem until another turning point, and that will be Islam. When the Muslims come to this area, they bring something with them which is totally different than so far. Let me try to bring up a little video segment here, see if it works, and to try to bring one of the issues here to conclusion and to try to speak about, let's see if this is working, to try to show and demonstrate once again the possible location of the temple as I mentioned earlier. I'm going to take it back. I'm going to open this one. Forgive me for talking to myself, but sometimes it works when I speak to myself and I bring up those things. I can sometimes do that easier. Let's see if it's gonna work. No, it's not working for some reason. So once again, give me another chance to do that. All right. It should work just well now, so I hope that you're able to follow.
Well, was the temple standing is one of those questions that you can answer in more than one way. Standing on the upper platform, someplace around here, no doubt. The question where exactly. If you ask me how come I don't know such an important place, the focal point of all the Jewish existence, you must know the right location. I will answer to that the Jews were not permitted to come on top of Temple Mount for nearly 2,000 years. And therefore the very location was forgotten. Right after AD 70, with the destruction of Jerusalem, Jews could see the city from a distance, Mount of Olives, but they could see it and watching at a pile of stones without having the chance to access it. So go figure where exactly. Under the pile of stones, the place was buried. And we speak about the Holy of Holies. We speak about the altar for the temple. So the upper platform, definitely, where exactly, that will be very hard to answer. So we need to rely on some other sources, somewhat informing sources, to try to figure out the location. We do know that David purchased a threshing floor. If there was a place on the upper platform that it's not covered by the man-made platform, but the naked padlock is still standing, has to be a reason why it wasn't covered. And lo and behold, there are two. One is inside the building called the Dome of the Rock today, and many scholars do believe that that's where the temple used to stand based on the naked bedrock. The Bible said that David purchased a threshing floor. A threshing floor is supposed to be level. The face of the rock inside is very rugged and not level. There was another place on top of Temple Mount that bedrock is not covered by the man-made platform, and it is totally level, and that's the one you see in front of you. So when we try to look for the right location, key number one would be to find a place which is bedrock, not covered by the man-made platform, but that's not enough. We need to rely on some other sources as well. The first evidence that we have given to us by a French pilgrim that came for the town of Bordeaux in France is given to us in the year 333, and it gives us a report that the Roman and now Christian authorities allowing the Jews to come up to the temple once a year to mourn for the temple, and the Jews are going to a stone that has a hole in it. The stone inside the building has a hole in it. But the question should stay. How did they know where to go more than 270 years after the temple was destroyed? Where was the guarantee they went to the right place? Therefore, we need to rely on some other clue. It's a riddle that we need to put those pieces together. The Bible tells us in Numbers chapter 19 about the red heifer. No reason is given why we need to burn a holy cow and to use the ashes for purification. But when it came to Jerusalem, there was a certain way to burn the red heifer, and there was a certain connection topographically with the temple as well. In the Jewish Mishnah, which is the oral law, the book of commentary, it says that when the high priest assistant was offering the red heifer, he did that on an altar that was built specifically on top of Mount of Olives. I'm sorry, not on top, halfway up the Mount of Olives. And he could see while sacrificing the red heifer from that altar above the eastern gate and through the temple gates. Well, you can see in front of you, which is not easy, the domes of the eastern gate today. And you can mark a line up to the Mount of Olives. And if we understand that the altar, the gate, and the temple should stay on the same line, then we are standing now, give or take, on the same line. And that will lead us to the other platform, to the other naked bedrock, which is called by the Muslims the Dome of the Spirits. So by this theory, at least, we should conclude that the temple could not stand where the golden dome is at. The temple should be someplace around here, because we do know the eastern gate, that did not change. We know the Mount of Olives. And if you mark a line from Mount of Olives above the eastern gate, it will take you over here.
Okay, well, maybe that was easier now to understand. I was supposed to bring that up a couple of minutes ago, just forgot. So we now try closing this whole idea of where exactly was the temple standing. As I said, there's at least two good possibilities and maybe more than two. Let's go back now to the chronology, and we are speaking about the days of Islam and the conquest of Jerusalem by the Muslims. And this is something that historians even today are quite puzzled by. Well, this is what happened, which is quite amazing in a very short time. People come out from the Arabian desert. We don't speak about the mighty empire yet. People are coming out without any specific administration, without any decent organization. In a very short time, they conquer the world, basically, North Africa, big parts of Asia, everything that we can call the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, big parts of them are now in Muslim hands. And the question is, how did they do that? Well, there are two answers to that. Number one, the Persians on one side, the Parthians on one side, and the Byzantines on the other side, after 300 years of constant fights and confrontations, they were simply exhausted. Only a few years before the Muslim hordes are conquering the area, there was another bitter struggle between the Persians and between the Byzantines. So wars after wars, a fresh power, highly motivated, comes out from the desert, and in a very short time, they're able to defeat the two superpowers and to conquer a large area. The second reason, which is almost also very important, is that this is the first time in world history that people are going to conquer the world because they are commanded to do so in their scriptures. Keep in mind that back in the days of the ancient empires, the gods of Assyria, the gods of Babylon, the gods of Rome, the gods of Greece never ordered anybody to conquer the world for them. Neither is the God of Israel. Jesus did not say, you're going to conquer the world for me and spread my religion by the sword. Islam does. And therefore, this motivation to go and conquer the world because you are commanded to do that in the Quran, it gave those Muslims a lot of advantages, of course, and high motivation, and they were able to do that in a short time. And that presented two major issues almost right away. Number one, it's a big area. Islam did not have the right organization, the right administration, the right know-how, how to run such a huge area. Second problem was that Mecca and Medina, the two holy places to Islam, are simply too far away. In the middle of the desert, it's very hard to control the large territories that you conquered by doing that from Mecca and Medina. You need to find a more central location, and that will lead to a major conflict within Islam. It was the first caliph of Islam, who was called Muawiyah, that decided to move his capital to Damascus because Damascus is much more central, and that brought up a lot of problems in the Muslim world. The main problem was that if you are truly a Muslim ruler, you have to rule from the centers and not from a place which is far away. So in their distress, they needed a place in the area that they can connect somehow to the Quran, that they can make some significant logic and reason out of it. And there was Jerusalem. Wasn't that far away from Damascus. The town was in ruins and Temple Mount was in ruins, not claimed by anybody. The question was, how do we make a connection between Jerusalem and the Quran? Because keep in mind, folks, Jerusalem is not mentioned in the Quran, not even once. So there was a political need to calm down the Muslim clergy for moving from Mecca to Damascus and to try to find a connection in the Quran. And here comes chapter 17 in the Quran. Chapter 17 in the Quran speaks about the night flight of Muhammad, the night journey. He was taken from Mecca to the most remote area, the most remote mosque. No name is mentioned where that was, but now you can easily make a connection with Jerusalem to be that remote mosque that the Quran speaks about in chapter 17. And then the Quran teaches that Muhammad had ascended from that location for one night, and there was a session up there attended by God and the angels and prophets, and Jesus, Nabi Isa, who is a prophet of Islam. And after a long session, everybody agreed that Muhammad is the most updated and well-versed prophet, and the whole world should follow him. Well, where was this ascension? In the most remote mosque? Bang, Jerusalem. And therefore they made that connection, proclaiming Jerusalem a holy place to Islam, the third holiest place, and that did not go without resistance. The clergy in Mecca had a lot to lose if you had a competition in Jerusalem. And therefore within Islam, centuries went by before Jerusalem was accepted by the whole Muslim faith as a place of significance. They started building two main buildings. This one, the Dome of the Rock, is a shrine protecting the rock that marks the ascension of Muhammad, dedicated 692, and the other central building is the Mosque of Al-Aksa. Today, sometimes the whole mountain is called Al-Aqsa by the Muslim. This one was dedicated 705, although they started much earlier. It was a wooden building at first, and it took this shape and form only a few centuries later on. So from the 8th century, late 7th century, Jerusalem was called Al-Quds, so the Holy One, is officially a holy place to Islam as well. And then came the Crusaders, Christians once again, and you would assume that they will repeat the same practice as they did the first time, destroy everything, throw their garbage in the Temple Mount. That did not happen. Basically, they replaced the crescent on top of the Dome of the Rock with a cross. It was called Templum Domini, and we have a lot of evidences given to us by Christian pilgrims. European literature is full with hundreds of itineraries, which is a pilgrim's diary that speaks about his visit to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem. Almost everybody includes the Dome of the Rock or Templum Domini in their schedule. So now it's a very important place for the Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem. The other one, the Mosque of Aksa, was the palace of the Jerusalem kings until King Baldwin I died in 1118, and they moved to another palace that would be closer to Jaffa Gate. But the Knight Templars were basically born, the whole order was born at 1118 in the Mosque of Al-Aqsa, which is on top of Temple Mount. So the Crusaders treated Temple Mount with much respect, unlike the Byzantines. And once again, Temple Mount became to be a very important part of the pilgrimage of Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem, and Temple Mount was one of the focal points. After the Crusaders were defeated and the Muslims are back, Saladin, the 2nd of October, 1187, is coming back to town, and very quickly and without any problems, they removed the cross, replaced it with a crescent, and the mosque is once again a mosque. It's called Haram-e-Sharif, which means the noble holy place, and it is in that condition until this very day. So Islam has the upper hand in Jerusalem for nearly 1,300 years, with a short 88 years of intermission when the Crusaders were occupying the city. But most of the time it was in Muslim hands, and lo and behold, they're not very generous, quote unquote, to let other people come and visit the area. And therefore, no foreigners, no non-Muslims were permitted to come to Temple Mount. The place was not open for visits, true. Some people tried, but you had to dress up as a Muslim, and you took an enormous chance, because if you were caught up on top and you're not a genuine Muslim, it won't end well for you. And therefore, that was one of those mysterious places you can only see from a distance, from Mount of Olives, but visiting Temple Mount just for Muslims. In the 19th century, when the Ottoman Empire was willing to open up its gates and to give Christians some rights in the area, archaeologists started coming. They wanted to excavate around Temple Mount. They never got permission to do so, let alone to visit the top of Temple Mount. And then the First World War, and the Jerusalem and Palestine are conquered by the British, and Temple Mount is now open for visits, but not for Jews. The Jews were never allowed to go on top of Temple Mount until 1967. So 1967, a major turning point, and today the Temple Mount is open for everybody to visit. It was an opportunity for us when the city was liberated in June 7th of 1967 to change the situation on the ground as well. But this was something that we decided not to do. And therefore, Jerusalem today has in its heart the Temple Mount, the holiest place for the Jewish people that Jews cannot practice on in any way. So yes, we can visit, but the status quo that we made with the Arab authorities and the King of Jordan, who is the seer basically of the Temple Mount today, is that Jews can visit, they cannot practice any kind of religious practice on top of Temple Mount. Let me bring up another video here to, in a way, summarize what we said so far and see how successful that's going to be. So bear with me for a few minutes and we'll make it happen. I'm sure that we can. Okie dokie, just a second, please. Be with you in just a minute and hope that that will help to wrap it up, so they say.
70 AD was a big year in Jewish history, Jerusalem history. The city was conquered by the Romans. Everything was leveled down to the ground, including the temple. For about 60 years or so, there was nothing on top of Temple Mount, just the ancient ruins, piles of stones, ashes of timber. And then in 132, the Emperor Hadrian decided to proclaim Jerusalem as a Roman town and to build the city that will be named after him, Ilia Capitolina. It was maybe also a way to humiliate the Jewish holy place, to proclaim Temple Mount a temple for a Roman deity. And the temple was built on top of Temple Mount to Jupiter, which was the head god of the Roman Empire. Where exactly was the temple built, that will be hard to say. The Romans couldn't care less about the exact location of the Jewish Holy of Holies. Maybe that's what started that confusion, where exactly was the temple standing. After the days of Adrian and after the Roman Empire came to an end as a pagan entity, in the days of Constantine, temples to pagan gods were destroyed, including the one here in Jerusalem. For nearly 300 years, Jerusalem and Temple Mount were in the process of conversion to Christianity, and Temple Mount was once again a place of ruins and rubble. The idea was, if we leave Temple Mount in this condition, that will prove that Jesus was right in the statement he made and the prophecy in Luke chapter 19 about the destruction of the temple. So Temple Mount deliberately was totally neglected, and to make it even worse, the locals came to throw the dump and garbage on top of Temple Mount. That was the dump of Jerusalem. Another turning point in the mountain's history will be at 636, and that will be the coming of the Muslim hordes that came out from the Arabian desert. Historians are puzzled even today, how did they do that so quickly? How Islam was so successful to conquer the world, literally speaking, defeating in the process the two mighty empires of the era, the Romans on one side and the Persians on the other side. Well, probably the answer must be that the two superpowers were so exhausted after centuries of struggle that a fresh, highly motivated force couldn't do that. And also, the first time ever that anybody, any religion, any group of people went to do battle in behalf of their religion were indeed the Muslims. The Roman gods never ordered anybody to conquer the world for them, neither did Jesus. The first time the motivation to go to war was religious was the coming of the Muslim hordes. They did an extremely well job, and they conquered the large in a very short time, and that led to two main problems. Problem number one was the empire was simply too big, and to control such a large area from the Muslim holy cities of Mecca and Medina was totally ineffective. And therefore they needed another capital, a capital that they can rule from in a more significant way. For that reason, they chose the city of Jerusalem that was in ruins by then. It was Moriah, the first caliph of the Umayyad house, that made that choice, and that led to a lot of discontent, especially among the Muslim clergy. Because if you are a true caliph, you need to govern Muslim territories from the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Jerusalem was not. And therefore there was an open rebellion in Mecca as well, and something had to be done. And that something was to try a way, to find a way to connect Jerusalem with the Quran. The city is not mentioned in the Quran not even once, but chapter 17 of the Quran speaks about the night journey of Muhammad. He was leaving Mecca and had a night journey to the most remote area the Quran teaches, without mentioning a name to that remote area. Well, Muslim scholars will show later on that the journey of Muhammad brought him to Jerusalem. He had ascended from the city for one night, and they had a session up there attended by God and angels and prophets. And after a long session, everybody agreed that Muhammad is the one true prophet and all mankind should follow his lead. Keep in mind, no name of place is given. But based out of a necessity and based on some politics, they had to make that linkage and connection between the journey of Muhammad and Jerusalem to add some significance to the city, to the Muslim faith as well. So these were the circumstances, and that's how Jerusalem came to be holy to Islam. They call it Al-Quds, the Holy One. And they had to find that linkage to try to calm down some of the unrest in the Muslim territories as a result of proclaiming Damascus as capital. And to make it official, they built two main buildings. The Dome of the Rock was dedicated by Abd al-Malik at 692 AD. It's not a mosque in the common sense. It's a shrine protecting the rock. The mosque for public prayers was added later on, 705 by Marwan. And that will be the Mosque of Al-Aksa, which is marking the place where Muhammad came to, and his ascension took place on the same rock, which is inside the Dome of the Rock today. These two buildings are old. These two buildings are very significant to the Muslims. Look at this one. You see the ceramics over there, which were made by the emperor, by the Sultan Suleiman, the magnificent. The golden dome was added about 25 years ago, replacing the old dome that was made of lead. It was Jordanian money. It was invested in order to make that project. And today it's considered to be the third holiest place to the Muslim world. In 1999, the Crusaders are coming over, and the place is conquered by the Crusaders. They proclaim the place a church, build a cross on top, put a cross on top, and call it Templum Domini. In fact, the mosque that you see in front of you was the palace of the Crusader kings for a while. And the Nine Templars, I'm sure that some of you heard about, they were born as a group of warrior monks, 1118, at the very same building. 1187, October 2nd, Saladin is reconquering Jerusalem from the Crusaders, replacing the cross with a crescent, and that's the way it is until this very day. I have to say that until 1967, Jews were not permitted to come to the Temple Mount, sometimes to the Western Wall, yes, but not the Temple Mount. But since 1967, it was a status quo that prevails on top of the mountain. The place is open for visits to anybody who wants to, but religious manifestations are permitted only to Muslims. Until 1967, the place was not open for visits except for Muslims. So this is a new chapter in the city's history. Many people do come to visit, but the status quo is very clear. Anybody can visit, but prayers and any kind of religious gestures only by the Muslim worshippers.
Well, I'm sure that seeing stuff twice, you don't have any objection to that. It's sometimes good to repeat some stuff. And I do know, because many people would ask me in Jerusalem, aren't we frustrated? And this is so upsetting that we cannot go up to Temple Mount, the holiest place for the Jewish people. Well, to be absolutely honest with you, most Jewish sages are in the opinion that Jews should not go up to Temple Mount. And the reason is the issue of purity. We cannot bring ourselves to the level of purity required without the ashes of the red cow. And since we don't have the red cow anymore, by visiting Temple Mount, we may define the whole mountain. So it's a little skeptic approach maybe, but that's exactly part of it. We do not know the timing. I'm just representing the Jewish rabbinical circles that most of them will advise or command their disciples not to go up to Temple Mount. So it's not a major issue even politically, because most people would not go even if there would be such a permission or such a deal made with the Muslim authorities because of the purity issue. However, there's always a group in between, and people that call themselves religious but nationalists as well. Among their rabbis, you hear voices recently that we should aspire to go back to Temple Mount because the Western Wall is a place of humiliation. We had to settle for the Western Wall because we were not sovereigns in town, and therefore we were not led by others to go to the holiest place. But now we are sovereigns, so why won't we go up and reclaim the place? Well, again, you hear different views about what should be the future of Temple Mount. Let's go with what the Bible says. God knows the timing. Ezekiel speaks about another temple. We do not know when. We know the location, same place, although the dimensions of Ezekiel's temple are much, much bigger even than Herod's temple. So once again, we have to leave that to God's hand to decide whenever he chooses to bring us back and to rebuild another temple. Well, that will be it for today. And I hope that you enjoyed the information. Maybe you learned something new about what you saw today. And if you have any questions about what you saw, if you are more interested in those issues, don't hesitate to email me, and go to my webpage as well to find some information about temple and temple issues. Well, thank you for joining me. And until next time, may the God of Israel richly bless you from Jerusalem. Bye-bye.